I'm Darren Morton,
I'm Simon Matthews. This is Lift.
the Lifestyle Medicine podcast where we dive into the science of health and well-being. Hello, Simon. Good to see you, brother. How are you doing on this fine day?
Thank you very much, Darren. Doing very, very well. Very well.
That is nice.
Yeah. Looking forward to our conversation today, as always.
For sure. So here's my question to you, because I know you're an aviator, aren't you?
Yeah.
But have
I
you
love
ever
aviation.
jumped out of a plane?
Are you crazy? Of course I haven't jumped out of a plane.
Really? You've never jumped? Yeah.
No. Why would you do that? That's the silliest thing in the world. But by the way, this is also the same reason that I don't fly the things you fly.
Well,
those little things where you kind of you go out to the park and you build them there and then you jump off a cliff.
Pretend planes.
Pretend planes. I like my wings bolted on in the factory. Which is also the reason I don't jump out of planes. If your wings are bolted on and the plane is flying fine, why would you jump out of it?
Well, you're a sensible kind of guy, and I sort of probably anticipated that response. But I actually have jumped not out of a hang glider, which is those pretend planes that I fly, but I have jumped out of a plane, and it actually happened a bit spontaneously. Really, we were on a trip in New Zealand, and we had to be at the airport later that evening. And so we were driving, I think it was late morning, driving along the road, minding our own business. There was this big thumping sign that says, skydiving this way. And for some reason, we were driving around this camper van and with some friends. They had a camper van behind us and they just automatically turned. And even as I was turning, I was thinking, what are we doing this for? Anyway, we ended up by fronting up and literally we'd hardly got the words out of our mouth as we arrived at this little office area, like, tell us a little bit more. And they were suiting us up. and then next thing there was myself, there was my wife, and one of my colleagues here, who's very adventurous. But I tell you what, it was terrifying. I got to confess, like I've been very high, like I've been to 13,000 feet in my hang glider, and I think we jumped from. It was a little lower than that. But I remember I was just sitting there clutching the side of this plane. And obviously it was a tandem jump. Yeah, so I wouldn't do this on my own. But I suspected that the person that I was attached to was slightly crazy. And that sort of is just it's just a bit disconcerting. So I was sort of sitting there going, how did this happen? And there was my colleague, she's very adventurous, but she was sort of, you could tell she was anxious because she's chatty, like, da, 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 da. And my wife, of all of us, is I would have thought the least adventurous. She's like, yeah, let's go. She was highly excited about this thing. But anyway, I will confess that when we finally sort of tumbled out of this plane, that I did sort of squeal just a little bit, and it wasn't that it wasn't that manly. But anyway, but I want to talk about parachutes.
So can I say, first of all, that I'm really glad you're here to tell this story, because you began telling me this story by saying, when I jumped out of a plane, it was kind of spontaneous. And stories that begin, I spontaneously jumped out of a plane, generally don't have a good ending.
That's correct. That's right. You want to think it through before you jump out of a plane. That's probably the moral of that story. But I do, and as you have alluded to, I hang glide, and in the side of my hang glider, my harness, I have a parachute pack there, and it brings me great comfort when you get high to know that you've got this parachute here. I've never used it, I never want to use it, but here's the fascinating thing: parachutes have some serious problems with them, and yet I still find comfort in the fact that I've got one packed in my harness. And so what I'd love to do is share with you what I think are 4 major problems with parachutes. And it just so happens they're the exact same 4 problems that persist with lifestyle medicine. So
nice.
Are you ready? Are you ready for some problems with parachutes?
I'm ready.
Okay, so here is the first one. The first problem with parachutes is, did you know, Simon, that there is no good evidence, and by good, I'm talking about, the highest standard of empirical.
A randomized control trial.
Yeah, a high rigorous studies. There's no highly, designed, implemented study to demonstrate that parachutes actually work. In fact, there was an article. There's some people had some fun with this. So there was an article published back in the British Medical Journal in 2003, and let me read the title of this. It was parachute use to prevent death and major trauma when jumping from an aircraft. A review of the randomized trials, and guess what they found? There are none. There are none.
And do you know what's missing? Do you know what's missing in particular?
Yeah.
The crossover.
This is it. And so this is you're straight onto it. So, in a purely sort of, scientific, rigorous form, if you want to demonstrate conclusively that something actually works, first of all, obviously you need to conduct a randomized control trial. So let's just think this through for a moment, just for those who haven't caught on just yet what that might look like. So what this involves is you get a group of, I was going to say suckers here, but that would be the wrong terminology. You get a group of willing victims.
Study participants.
Study participants, exactly, who said, yeah, we'd love to be part of a study like this. And then what you do is you would randomly, and it have to be blinded, so no one could know who's who in the zoo. And for the study to be the most rigorous kind, the researchers would have to be blinded to what the assignment allocation pattern was. So we get these people now randomly allocated to one of two groups. One group, lucky group, we might call them, they get a parachute packed in their backpack, whereas the others get stuffed full of tissues. And then what we do is we take them up high and then we go, jump out now. Boof. Or some of them might be sort of need a little bit of encouragement to get out the door. And then we, as researchers, we watch what happens. We observe.
Yeah.
So far, so good. But maybe not so good for half of them, at least. And then, as you've alluded to make this study to be sure, like to actually know that it wasn't just the parachute that had this great effect at helping overcome gravitational exertion. That then we'd have to get them all and say, all right, now swap over. So you get the tissues this time and you get the parachutes. And at the end of it, we observe what happens and document this. So clearly, no one's ever going to put their hand up for this study. And so that being the case, it's been argued that there is no good evidence, no pure, rigorous scientific research to demonstrate that parachutes actually work.
Fair enough. Don't use them.
Don't use them until so there's no randomized control trial that had ever been done until it was. In the famous words of Dr. Greger, I think it is, he says, until they put it to the test. And so it turns out, this is true story, published about a decade later in the British Medical Journal, they actually conducted a randomized control trial of parachutes and published this, and you can check the article out. And they canvassed about 109 willing participants. Of that, about 29 agreed to participate in the study. They were randomly allocated to one group that had a parachute, and another group. It wasn't This is interesting. It wasn't blinded, so people knew what they were actually receiving, either a parachute in their pack or nothing at all. And then they jumped. This was a nice spin to this study, actually. They allowed them not just to jump out of a plane, they could opt to jump out of a helicopter if they want. So, it was nice that they gave them that little bit of autonomy there. I'm sure you'd appreciate that. And then they got people to jump out of these craft, and the results were remarkable. What they found is that the parachutes had zero effect, no effect whatsoever, which is a staggering outcome until you start to read the details of the methodologies used in the study. And as it turns out, the planes and the helicopters that they were released from weren't actually in flight. So they were actually parked on the ground. And sure enough, the parachutes had no effect, which I think and obviously this was a tongue-in-cheek study, but published in BMJ. And they, they made this point once again that, even methodologies and sometimes what studies tell us can be a little bit misleading unless you dive down into the details of what actually went on.
Yeah.
What that article was first published, that one that sort of said, hey, you know what, we've done a review of all the literature and looked for all these RCTs and there aren't any, and so parachutes clearly don't work. There's no good evidence for them. What this was done as, it was almost a pushback to say, you know what, people that are so obsessed, and in the scientific community we see this, that are so obsessed with, I'm not listening to anything that is not crossover design, double-blinded, randomized control. And why they made this point is that, that's very problematic because there are some things that you just can't test in that way. And lifestyle medicine belongs in that boat. They make the point that if you look at, for example, a nutrition intervention, or if you look at an exercise intervention, people know what you're doing to them. It can't be unblinded. And so they make this really lovely point. And in fact, I think this was a little bit aggressive, the tone of this, but they in that article, they actually concluded by saying, we suggest that the most radical protagonists of evidence-based medicine that are demanding this kind of evidence actually be recruited to participate in the first ever
in the next
in parachute design. Now, I think maybe that's going a little bit too far, but what I will say is that I would love for those radical protagonists and those dissenting voices against lifestyle medicine, I do wish they would participate in a lifestyle medicine intervention and experience it for themselves. And I think that it would, in a nutshell, change their tone.
It also tells us something else really important about lifestyle medicine and about knowledge, how we gain knowledge and how we use knowledge. And that is that all of us are capable of making reasonable inferences about outcomes from other knowledge that we have.
Yes.
So no, a randomised controlled trial hasn't been conducted of this, but we can all do what I'm fond of calling the thought experiment about this, based on our other knowledge, to reach, what's likely to be a pretty reasonable conclusion, or at least reasonable enough for the purposes that we need it for. No one's conducted a randomised controlled trial to see whether eating 750 grams of coal daily for 12 weeks, leads to some either beneficial or negative health outcome. But, I can reasonably infer that if that's the only thing that you're eating, that's probably not going to be great for you. We don't actually need to do that RCT.
Yeah, I like that. And I think, obviously the laws of physics, if you do the mathematics, you can see, hey, a parachute's probably going to work. And in the same way, if you look at the, our physiological laws, there's a whole lot of, it makes sense that these lifestyle changes are what, works best for us. And in addition to that, we have, what's considered sort of lesser forms of evidence, but, case studies. But these are powerful. And, I remember, but it is fascinating how these dissenting voices really do push back against it. And, I saw this firsthand. This was over a decade ago now. We published a paper on a lifestyle intervention that we were, observing. It was the CHIP program, Complete Health Improvement Program, now known as PIVIO. But we had data on 5,000 participants in this program. 30-day intervention, excuse me. And over the 30 days, we saw about 40% of the people who had blood sugar levels indicative of diabetes reduce it to, normalize their blood sugar levels. Excuse me. Interesting, when we submitted that article for publication, some of the feedback we got, and in fact, we got knocked back by a first journal because they said, you didn't have a control group. How do you know it wasn't other things? And I'm like, yeah, because 5,000 people spontaneously get better. So, problem one with parachutes is there's no good evidence they actually work. Here's number two. Excuse me. Number two, parachutes don't work unless they're big enough.
Yeah, True.
This is the exact
True.
same problem we see with lifestyle medicine.
Yeah.
We hear about people, oh, I'm going to stop putting, I'm going to put half as much butter on my toast each morning.
Yeah.
And over the course of the year, the great outcomes are expected. Well, that's a tiny parachute.
Yeah, exactly right. Like jumping out of an aeroplane, holding a handkerchief over your head.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And I've got stories where I've seen that this take place where actually parachutes in the hang gliding, the parachutes we use aren't as big as normal parachutes. And there are accounts of people who have actually deployed these chutes, and because they haven't been big enough, it hasn't been enough to overcome the gravitational pull. And that's ended in disaster. And I think we can see the same thing, in the lifestyle medicine world when we have small parachutes, when the interventions that we apply aren't large enough. Well, you don't see change, and that can be, from a coaching perspective. I know that you could speak lots to that. It's sort of disempowering. People are trying, but it's not really working. So getting the size of the parachute right, I think, is a really important consideration.
Yeah, and that also speaks to something else in human behaviour, which I must say I don't completely understand, except to say that I recognise that it's a part of human behaviour, and that is our capacity to convince ourselves that we're doing something useful or worthwhile that may not be. In my mind, I'm thinking about that word that was coined, maybe 15, 20 years ago. I'm not sure. The word is slacktivism, and it's a play, obviously, on the word activism. And the implication, perhaps a little harsh, is the idea that people do things for a cause, but in the kind of laziest possible way that you can, to make it feel like you're doing something useful when in fact you're not. For example, an online petition turns up in your email inbox. So you type your initials at the bottom of it, send it off, and don't think about it anymore. It's a good example of slacktivism. You probably feel a little bit better, and you feel like, I've added my voice to that. Has it really done anything? Probably not, and it probably never will. So this seems to be part of. I mean, it's almost like it's part of the human condition, I think, to convince ourselves that we're doing something worthwhile, doing something that matters, doing something that's important, but it may not be as impacting as we believe it to be. So it's a good lesson to really ask that hard question: is this sufficient to make a difference? Is this sufficient to do what I want it to do?
Yeah, actually, I've never heard that term, selectivism. That's clever, and I agree with that. But I suppose on this point of how big is the parachute, another question that comes to mind is, well, how big does the parachute need to be?
Lift is supported by the Lift Project, an educational adventure where you learn science-based ways to lift your mood and your life. The Lift Project is lifting lives around the globe, in healthcare settings, workplaces, schools, universities, and communities. To find out more, visit theliftproject.global.
And it's probably different for different people. And so I think that, that first point about, the first problem with parachutes is there's no good evidence to actually work. I think that we're over that now. I think that, I'd say going back a decade ago, there were still those dissenting voices that, this doesn't work. I don't hear that as much anymore. I think that we do have RCTs, and they're not blinded, but we can see we've got ample evidence to show that lifestyle medicine works. I think where the research question now lies is, well, how do we make them work best? And that involves a whole lot of new research questions. One of which is, well, how big do we need to go with this? And because obviously, if we can give maximum benefits, and get people safely down for the minimal size, and the minimal effort, because we are innately a bit slack probably, then I think that's a really valuable thing to understand. And so I think that as we see personalised medicine starting to come to the fore, I think there's real value in that.
Yeah. It's also a really useful resource question to ask too. And across my entire career as a psychologist, I have always been consumed. I've been consistently consumed by the question: what's the smallest meaningful intervention we can make what's the smallest intervention we can make that will produce a meaningful change in outcome? So that's a really useful question, and it needs to be bookended on the other side by what's the largest feasible intervention that we can make as well. If you've got to jump out of an aeroplane with a parachute on your back, but the size of the parachute necessary means that you need a 40-foot crate to be able to carry it, then clearly it's of no value. You simply can't do that. On the other hand, we don't want to be wasting precious resources if we can do something that demands far fewer resources as well.
Right.
And so these are really, really great questions.
Yeah, that's correct. So I think we're going to see more attention given to that. What's the size of the parachute, and what is the optimal size for different people depending on their circumstances. Maybe it's for someone who's jumping out of a plane that's not moving, that's on the ground. It's a whole lot different than someone who's free falling from 10,000 feet. So I think it's going to be an interesting thing. So you just
reminded me too. Here's another what's the word I'm looking for? Another artifact that we often see in healthcare and lifestyle medicine as well. We've talked about this before, and this is the outlier effect. There are stories of people who have fallen from planes or who have jumped out of a plane and their parachute hasn't opened, and they've survived. Some of them quite seriously injured, but they've survived. That proves nothing.
No.
I mean, it's a pleasant outcome, I suppose, to kind of wake up on the other side of an experience like that. But similarly in lifestyle medicine, we read accounts of the person who, the person we've spoken to in the past, Jeanne Calment, the French woman who reputedly died at 115, having smoked half a packet of cigarettes every day of her life. Does that mean that smoking's okay? No, clearly not. She's a statistical outlier. So we need to be careful not to let our attention be drawn to those outliers. And make them representative of the outcomes we can expect.
Yes. And the optimal parachute size for all. Certainly. Yeah. All right, so two problems with parachutes. One, there is no good evidence by the highest.
Can I say at this point with these two problems, I'm no longer interested at all in jumping out of a plane.
Well, okay. Well, it might get worse than that then. So here's problem number 3. So number 1, there's no good evidence they work. Number 2, they don't work unless they're big enough. And then number 3, the problem with parachutes is, you have to regularly maintain them and pack them. And look, I have friends who, have actually had to deploy chutes. And after one particular incident, it didn't go well. And so all of the members of our local hang gliding community, we did a repacking and deploying practice evening, and it was staggering how many of them didn't work. Like they wouldn't come out. They'd been in there for 2 years and got wet and soggy. Some were moth-eaten. And so everyone's just yeah. So what we know is that parachutes require regular maintenance, and this is where your world comes in, because lifestyle medicine is exactly the same. I'm a little bit tired of, I meet, we do work with workplaces, and you'll hear a CEO or someone in charge, and care of the others will say something like, to the effect, and it might not be these exact words, but it's like, hey, so what we want to do is something that will fix this problem forever. And I'm like, okay, right. Will you just tell me when was the last time you ate something that precluded you ever having to eat again? Or had a meal that sustained you for the rest of your life.
When was the last breath you took that sustained you for the next 5 years? Yeah,
that's exactly right. And I think that we need to shift our focus. A lot of, and I see this with even in the research space. That they want to know. Okay, so you've done an intervention there. How long does it last for? Follow them up 5 years later. Is it still working now? Well, you know what? People need that ongoing maintenance. They need that ongoing support. And how do we foster that? How do we encourage that? And of course, this is where, your world comes in with health coaching and all the behavioral change stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And sustainable change is certainly it's a current topic in behavioural change. In fact, I've published with colleagues about this very topic, the idea of sustainable change. There are two significant challenges in healthcare around sustainable change at the moment. One is that we don't really have that much evidence about sustainable change in comparison with the evidence that we have about initiating change.
Yes.
Initiating change is ridiculously easy. Ridiculously easy. If I offered you $10,000 right now to do 10 push-ups,
all right, done. It's a deal. We just shook on it.
Exactly right. You'd be on the floor before I finished the sentence. So I can elicit a behavioural change in you ridiculously easily. Getting you to, or having you keep doing that day in, day out, of course, is a different question. So we have much less research about that. The second challenge is there's not broad agreement about what sustainable actually means.
That's interesting.
Does it mean you make that one change and that stays in place for the rest of your life? Does it mean something different? And I argue quite strongly that the idea of a single change now, which is in place for the rest of your life, is a terrible outcome. And that's a terrible thing to aim for because it completely lacks flexibility and adaptation. That's the sort of change that leaves people marooned several months down the track because life circumstances change, health circumstances change, whatever. But if they're locked into this idea that this is the thing that I now do differently, then there's really no option for modifying that or adapting that. So what we really want to aim for, I think, is not a sustainable change, but a sustainable capacity to affect change in your life. In other words, we don't want to make the thing itself, whether it's eating bananas or doing push-ups or sleeping 9 hours a night or whatever it might be. We don't want to make that the thing that's sustained. What we want to do is invest the person with that capacity to sustain, and that ought to be the focus of the work that we do.
I like that. That's actually a new perspective for me. The idea of actually building the whole goal is to build people's personal resources so that they can.
Exactly right.
I suppose. Yeah, I like that.
Exactly right.
I really like that.
Then when you move house or you change job or, I don't know, your kids grow up and leave or your gym closes or, this week there's a shortage of tomatoes in the fruit store, you've actually got the capacity to navigate those changes and still do meaningful things that contribute valuably to your health, but without this kind of rigidity about sustaining a particular and specific behavioural change.
That's excellent. I like that. All right, you ready for our final problem with parachutes?
Well, you don't need to convince me not to jump out of the plane anymore, but okay, go on.
Let's just put well, this one here is worth noting. just in case you do find yourself jumping out of a plane.
Okay.
So number one, there's no good evidence they work. Number two, they don't work if they're not big enough. Number three, you have to maintain them. And fourth, and probably most importantly, parachutes don't work unless you deploy them. And
you're true.
I've got a story of a friend who was an incredible pilot, and I would say one of Australia's best pilots. He actually represented Australia on the national team. And he was not just an incredible cross-country pilot, but he did a lot of aerobatics as well. And he was actually performing, you can do in a hang glider that you have to, as long as you pull positive Gs the whole way around, it is actually possible to loop them. If you've got the right type of glider, they can get faster.
Okay.
And he could do these loops. Well, on this particular day, he was doing a double loop. So he actually looped and he came out and then went to loop again. And as he was coming out of the second loop, someone flew directly underneath him. And in order to avoid collision, he pushed the bar out more, which meant he banked a lot
Negative
harder.
Gs. Yeah.
And what happened is we think he passed out because of the G's force that he was experiencing.
Yeah, wow.
And when the glider stopped and stalled and then went to tumble, he just didn't react at all. And he didn't pull the chute. And tragically, he lost his life. And it was just a massive blow to the entire community. But, I always think of that parachutes, they don't work unless you deploy them.
Yeah.
And lifestyle medicine's the same. And I think that this is where the challenge comes in. So what does it look like to deploy these things, to deploy lifestyle medicine? And I think that's where the prime research attention needs to be today. What does this look like? How do we get a message like this out there at scale, for the benefit of many? And I'm thinking of your PhD research on implementation science, so trying to figure out, well, where do we get this out? It's definitely it's more than just healthcare settings, and obviously in medical settings that's there's real value in that, but it's other places too. It's community settings, and we've done a lot of work with Lift in this, where you can have you can reach thousands of people literally in a single blow. It's in schools. I think that there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done more focusing on educating our young in the principles of lifestyle medicine. In workplaces, I think there are huge opportunities in workplaces, and I think that's a really rich field to actually have positive influence on people. So I know that you've been doing a lot of work in this space, but I think how do we deploy these things? How do we help people to deploy these their own parachutes?
And these are in the interviews that I've already been conducting in this area. One of the things that's really emerging very clearly is even having that mental map or that framework of saying, we can deploy this in all these different areas. We can, primary care, secondary care, community settings, individuals, workplaces, education, and so on. Conceptually, that's true. You certainly can do that. And you need to attend to the particular microstructures, I'll call them, and the particular mechanisms and processes that exist within each of those places to do that successfully. Otherwise, you get left with that same problem. If I were to make a metaphor, it'd be like having that parachute in a bag strapped to your hang glider. But it's about 6 inches out of reach for you. Yeah. So you just, it's conceptually there, but you literally can't do anything with it.
That's right.
Because you just can't reach it. So,
So what can help with that, being able to reach it, is arms that extend far. And I think that this is, I suppose, how you've got good arms that extend far. But you know what? I think this is to wrap this up. I'd love to extend this challenge to everyone. To the people that are listening to this. What's your sphere of influence? And I think what this is going to call for is a lot of creativity. On how do we actually create models? How do we get lifestyle medicine in there, in different sectors, in different spaces for different people? And it's going to need a lot of workers, a lot of sandbags to really turn this tide. And I think that, lifestyle medicine, I'm a firm believer it will win the day at the end of the day. I'm very hopeful of that. It has to, it's the right thing to do, and it makes so much sense. And yeah, there are forces that are conspiring against it, but with enough, momentum, and it's building momentum, it'll get there. And I actually think it's going to happen from the ground level, from people experiencing it for themselves, seeing the benefits of making sense for them, and then demanding it. And then I think it's also going to come from top down, where, through research, through economic imperatives, governments, they'll start to see the value, and maybe we'll meet in the middle. But I suppose, parachutes have problems, lifestyle medicine has problems, but where we're at today, and the most important and critical message is that it doesn't work unless it's deployed. And so I think that's a call to action to all of us, within our respective worlds or respective spaces. What can we do to champion this message?
Yeah. Deploy it. Make sure it's big enough. Don't spend too much time waiting to test it to see if it's going to work.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So I don't know if I've talked you out further. It sounds like of jumping from a plane. It was a fantastic experience. When I landed, I was very, very happy about it. And
I'm sure you were.
Not sure I'd do it again. I definitely like having my wings not bolted on, but at least very close to me. But yeah, maybe one day. Maybe one day I'll get there again.
Maybe. Well, I will gladly wait for you on the ground and say hello when you arrive.
Lift is presented by Simon Matthews and Darren Morton. It's sponsored by the Lift Project and supported by Avondale University. Music provided by Pixabay. If you have a question or a topic you would like to hear more about, send us an email to podcast@theliftproject.global. The Lift Project. Lift your mood, lift your life.